Hi, my name is Carolyn Weitzman. I'm a professor of urban planning here at the University of Melbourne, and it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce Dr. Melissa Permezel today. I want to begin by paying my respect to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the original occupants of the land in which we are going to be speaking today, and pay respect to their elders, both past and present. I'd also like to thank you all for coming. This is a fantastic collaboration that's just sprung up in the last few months that's involved at the University of Melbourne, the Sustainable Societies Institute, the Social Equity Institute, and also the Melbourne School of Design. But also we are working with RMIT and Monash, and what we're working towards is a big conference, which I'm sure you all know about, called Habitat 3, which will be taking place in Quito, Ecuador, in October of this year. And Dr. Melissa Permezel is going to be talking about one of the huge issues that we're going to be talking about, which is global frameworks for urban equity as part of the Sustainable Development Goals. For the first time, we're really talking about the fact that sustainability will rest on the shoulders of cities, and the future of us as human beings on the planet depends on what we do about climate change, and the future of climate change depends very much on what happens in cities. And there's that environmental sustainability perspective, but there's also the perspective, of course, that urban inequities are increasing, as indeed global inequalities are increasing, and how can we address those both through the mechanisms of urbanization. Over 1 billion people now live in inadequate, informal, insecure accommodation around the world, and 3 billion further people will be moving to cities in the next 20 years. So the challenge of what happens to our cities is a huge global challenge, but also within Australia, there is a huge challenge of growing inequalities in housing affordability, as we all know. And it's not that long ago that Australia had its share of Dudley mansions, a phrase I only heard about this week, which were self-built housing on sometimes very contaminated and insecure land. So we'll be talking about all of those challenges around housing, urban equalities, and climate change. I'm putting a lot on your shoulders, Melissa, sorry.
It's okay.
But I trust Melissa's shoulders to handle it. So a little bit about Melissa. She's an alumni of this university. She did her PhD here about 12 years ago, and she was saying to me before this talk began that she feels like her parents are here today listening, because Ruth Fincher, her supervisor, is here, as is Michael Weber, who is a big influence on her. And after working for a large consultancy, she moved with her partner, who's here today, Remy, to Nairobi, Kenya, and has become a long-term consultant with UN Habitat. I think I'm going to leave the introduction of Melissa there, because she can talk about her own work far more eloquently than I can. She'll be speaking for about 35 or 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. Over to you, Melissa. Don't forget to turn your...
I'll turn mine.
Okay.
There, I think that's on.
Oh, yes, you are on now.
Thank you, and thank you very much, Carolyn, for the invitation today. I really am thrilled to be back here in Melbourne, and to Alexia up the back, who's also been very helpful in organising me from Nairobi. So it is a pleasure to be back here, and I'm also very honoured, as Carolyn said, to have Professor Ruth Fincher and Michael Weber in the room today. They have been very influential on my thinking and on my professional career, so it's terrific to be able to be the one presenting to them for once in a more professional fashion than the other way around. As Carolyn said, I've been working for UN Habitat. I'm in the slum upgrading and housing branch, and undertaking policy work and tool development. Prior to that, I worked in the urban legislation, land and governance branch, and have also done some work for what's called the UNISDR, which is the UN's disaster risk reduction body. And I've been living in Nairobi now for almost 10 years with my family. Today I want to talk about the role of two specific global frameworks, the relatively new Sustainable Development Goals and UN Habitat's New Urban Agenda, and how their narratives support the goals of slum upgrading. Experience to date suggests that these frameworks, I would argue, play an important role. They provide an enabling umbrella and guide for governments and key decision makers, and they're a political tool, a policy referencing mechanism and incentive to promote more equitable urban processes and outcomes. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. There are other important frameworks, of course, and important global frameworks, the Sendai Disaster Risk Reduction Framework and the Paris Climate Change Agreement, for example, but I won't touch on those today. I'll just concentrate on the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda. I think it's also important to note that the New Urban Agenda is not an official document and will be debated by member states in the forthcoming official UN Habitat 3 meeting in Quito that Carolyn was just referring to. And as per most UN processes, it's a document that will be decided and endorsed by member states. And in fact, UN Habitat has set up a separate entity, the Habitat 3 Secretariat, to manage that whole process. So it's actually a little bit separate from UN Habitat. And that will be something that I'll refer to, but just to keep in mind that it's not a final document that I'll be talking about. Just a brief word on urban equity in relation to how we understand it in terms of slum upgrading. Urban equity, of course, is based on the idea that urban development and urbanisation processes should not just ensure access for all urban dwellers to what we call the urban advantage, or the availability and access to spaces and services, etc., within urban systems. But urban development must grapple with a recognition that there are individuals and groups who, for a whole range of reasons, become marginalised in those processes, and that addressing power, relations of power, etc., to promote their inclusion and engagement is fundamental. So we consider equity in terms of a specific focus on improving the lives of slum dwellers, and slum upgrading should create some redistributive mechanisms and outcomes. So they are included, slum dwellers, that is, into the broader urban process and systems, but also that those processes and systems in fact become defined and representative and influenced by slum dwellers. So there's a reciprocal relationship that ultimately is attained. Okay, so if you look at just summarising that in the slide there, if we look at the current estimation on slum dwellers, we can see that they remain a startling urban equity challenge. And despite the success of the MDGs, which lifted more than 320 million people living in slums out of that environment, gaining access to improved water, sanitation, less crowded housing arrangements, that we find today there remain 1 billion slum dwellers in the world, and you'll see some fairly startling regional figures there in some parts of the world. So the official figure actually, as estimated by UN Habitat, is 881 million. But we consider this an underestimation of the numbers of global slum dwellers, given the limitations around how the 5 deprivations upon which the slum household definition is based and the number of slum dwellers is arrived at is measured. So we tend to talk about 1 billion slum dwellers. So the main point is, though, that there are 1/7 of the world's population living in very deprived and difficult conditions, and are a stark reminder of the deep inequalities inherent in urbanisation, which is particularly, I think, a very important figure, given that now most of the world is urban and urbanising very rapidly. And in fact, some regions, such as Africa and Asia, for example, have incredibly increasing urban populations and predicted slum populations. Also, just to clarify, UN Habitat makes a distinction between slums and informal settlements and sees them as part of a continuum of housing and quality of life deficits, with slums representing the most deprived and on the continuum. And UN Habitat takes the view that the impoverished urban conditions that slums and informal settlements represent are in fact also a global phenomenon. They exist in both developed and developing countries through responses to the challenge, through different challenges, and must be understood as such. And if you look at major international reports, such as the one from the UNECE on Europe, for example, you'll find that there is in fact a rise of these sorts of informal contexts in many major European centres. And we shouldn't forget, as Carolyn pointed out, that it wasn't so long ago that parts of Fitzroy, Carlton, Brunswick were considered deprived urban areas of Melbourne. And in fact, there remain these sorts of deprived urban areas. I think I remember last year reading about the Jesuit Social Services report showing that half of Victoria's prisoners and prison admissions came from 6% of postcodes in the Melbourne area. So I think this whole question of deprived urban areas really I think it's right that it's taken as in a global context. Within each context, they are challenges and need to be addressed. I now want to turn to the participatory slum upgrading program, which is the flagship program of UN Habitat, which works on slums and is located in the slum upgrading unit where I work. It started from a response to the pivotal 2003 report publication called The Challenge of Slums. And whilst UN Habitat had been doing work on various activities on improving urban governance around water and sanitation, this was probably the first very focused and comprehensive slum upgrading program. And as we speak today, the program is being undertaken in 35 countries, around 160 towns and cities, and is a partnership with the countries themselves, the European Commission, and the Secretariat of the African, Caribbean and Pacific states. So it's quite a strategic alliance, and UN Habitat, of course. Within the framework of an official memorandum of understanding, which has to be signed by all stakeholders in the country themselves, includes a series of principles, which I have just shown you up on the slides. And the program has been traditionally divided up into phases. We have the background profiling, situation analysis, the development of the country team, the development of a citywide slum upgrading strategy, the implementation of pilot projects, and then we go to what we call at scale, where we try to promote countries to not focus on one-off projects, but look at the urban context as a whole and really start to implement the upgrading strategy across the whole of the city. The core aspects of the program are inclusion, the participation of slum dwellers and other key stakeholders through the country teams. So it's mandatory that you have all the relevant departments and really the senior urban management involved, as well as representatives who are elected through as much of a democratic process as possible from the slum dwellers themselves. And this is often the first time over a long period of time that these groups work together, not just in a one-off meeting, but as part of the requirement for the program. And of course the program, not surprisingly because it's a UN program, is underpinned by the human rights-based approach to programmatic implementation and promotes components like no forced evictions, good governance principles and the inclusion of slum dwellers themselves in all programmatic processes and outcomes. So is participatory in process and inclusive in outcome. I just want to make that distinction. And that there is financing for community-led and implemented projects. The project promotes a citywide approach, which I just talked about, and the development of the citywide slum upgrading strategy, and is focused on being interactive and integrative in all key ways. Perhaps most importantly, in gaining recognition and momentum for the rights and the value of slum dwellers to stay put, as we often talk about, and be included into broader urban framework systems, plans and services. And the human rights-based approach is achieved through a lot of background work done by the political component of this partnership, which is the ACP Secretariat, which is made up of senior level government and decision makers from the Africa, Caribbean and Pacific states, who really provide that political momentum to carry the program forward through to the country team and really the way that we structure the processes and the methodology of the program. PSUP, as we call it, is now moving into the next phase of the program. It's been operating now since 2008 and it's about to be upscaled even further, and the EC and the ACP have made bold new policy and financial commitments for country level upscaling, which we're very happy about. And the EC sees the program as delivering on its recently endorsed urban development framework, and the ACP sees it as addressing one of the major challenges in the regions, in the Caribbean, African and Pacific regions. I just want to talk briefly now about what the program has achieved, and I'll just focus on four components that I think are useful to reflect on when we start to think about global frameworks of urban equity. And I'll draw on some of the country level work I've been undertaking in developing impact stories about the program and how countries themselves have engaged with the question of slum upgrading, and also from the monitoring and evaluation reports that come from the European Commission, which every second year monitors the program. This is just a fancy slide showing really the depth and breadth of the program, and you'll see the different countries there listed down the bottom. But one of the first and I think most important outcomes is the enabling strategic partnership. I think it can't be underestimated that bringing together the financing of the European Commission, the expertise of UN Habitat and then the political momentum of the ACP really provides a holistic response to slum upgrading. It brings money, skills and the political will, and they're fundamental in what is basically an urban challenge that's about vested interests. It's about groups of people who have traditionally just been left behind, and making major changes to those requires this kind of partnership. The second one then that really comes about from that enabling framework is really the mindset change, and I think this is also quite important, that the program helps steer urban development in another direction. It puts people at the heart of the process, not just the slum dwellers' physical conditions. It effectively breaks down the level of detachment from poverty and informality as urban norms and as a dominant form of urbanisation towards something that is about people, their livelihoods and how they can be better integrated into the rest of the city. And I don't think that can be underestimated as an impact. So this is important as by having a people-centred approach enables governments to factor in consider other factors around slums and slum dwellers in relation to economic development, livelihood generation, as well alongside improvements to water and sanitation. It also helps, I think, establish more nuanced thinking around who actually are the people in slums and what they're doing, and it also enables a better analysis of experiences of difference, marginalisation to be considered, which I think brings about more long-standing and transformative outcomes. I just want to show you then in this section some slides from some of the senior people that whether they're at municipal level or federal government level, that have given us feedback about the impact of the program. The program, I guess, thus provides, in terms of this, one of the second change around mindsets, a counter message to the very physical conditions of slums, as I said, to one with a stronger human face and one around the rights and capacities and knowledge that slum dwellers have to contribute to this question of urbanisation. The third impact that I want to talk about today is the value and impact of participatory planning. For the first time, I think it's fair to say, I guess in a very strategic and big-scale way, many governments and decision makers experience the value of participatory planning and understand it more clearly through the experience of the program, and that it can deliver basic urban services, and in fact takes the pressure off governments to come up with the solutions for everything. And I think this is again very important, and it really transforms the theoretical aspect of planning into an experiential one, which gives them confidence to then apply it into other planning processes, which are often traditionally very hierarchical and not inclusive, or have limited levels of inclusion of both other levels of government and certainly other stakeholders. The final change that I wanted to highlight was the change in institutional responses to slums and slum upgrading. So for many countries, and combined with the mindset change that occurs, PSUP starts to reorganise institutional arrangements, and through the programmatic requirements for participation of all key government departments and actors, both senior levels and those working on technical issues, stakeholders start to adopt a different view of how to work together and really start to collaborate much more effectively. And again, I think this often leads to more systematic, although very slow, but systematic changes within the way that institutional arrangements are undertaken to address slum upgrading. So the program then becomes, I guess, a pilot and a practical experience of what it means to work in a coordinated and inclusive fashion, and actually engages program beneficiaries and enacts planning frameworks in an integrated manner. And this change is also fundamental to start a shift towards prevention, I think, and the development of the mandatory citywide slum upgrading plan is often the first time that slums have been planned for in a positive and integrated manner, and departments across different levels of government alongside national structures have worked together to do this type of systematic planning, and I think that's a very important impact, particularly in countries where you have a real mix of sometimes remaining strong colonial structures combined with perhaps hierarchical and traditional approaches to governance. This provides them again with that experience of undertaking and organising their institutional arrangements differently. Now there are other important outcomes that are achieved through the program. For example, it's mandatory that there's some financial planning that's undertaken. And we consider this as very effective because slum upgrading and a participatory approach is cost money, time and resources, and we consider it very important that this is a conversation that's always had alongside the question of the planning itself. The attention given to vulnerable groups and groups such as women and youth is also important. It fosters a recognition of their rights and needs and provides leadership and participation opportunities. And in the country teams, right from the country teams that are put in place in each of the projects where women and youth have got to be engaged, through to the 10% of funds that must be dedicated to community level practical projects. Now in terms of programmatic limitations, there are, of course, they exist. and the delivery of practical impacts on the ground has sometimes been slow and criticised accordingly. The program also relies heavily on individual champions, so that the long-term institutionalisation of participatory slum upgrading can also be slow and somehow vulnerable to the change in individual power or political arrangements. And it's fair to say that ultimately some of the deeper structural inequalities and interests that play a key part in the political economy of slums and urbanisation are pretty tough to address and take time to change, and especially those in relation to land. And there are also some country-level capacity challenges. The depth and breadth of skills to deal with an at-scale program is also something that has to be looked at in the long term. People need time to work together and to develop the appropriate skills and bring together resources to do that. And finally, in some regions, there's no doubt that forced evictions are still very much on the table as a legitimate approach to managing the slum challenge. And we also find that there's poorly thought out mass housing schemes that are also put in place, and the idea of building large high-rise apartment buildings for the urban poor remains very popular, but are often focused solely on the housing delivery with little consideration, of course, of questions around economic and livelihood generation, social support networks and social capital. And PSUP, of course, has to contend with some of the mindsets around these more conventional responses to slums and slum dwellers as somehow illegal. Turning now to this question of global frameworks, I want to now just reflect on these in relation to the sort of what they mean for a program such as ours in UN Habitat. And I'll talk a little bit about the SDGs and the New Urban Agenda, as I said. So it was interesting, when I spoke with Carolyn about this talk, I went and talked with one of our long-standing colleagues in the organisation. And in regard to this question of the role and impact of global frameworks on urban equity and particularly slum upgrading, from the MDGs to the SDGs, and his comments speak to the heart, I think, of the politics around these agendas. The governments, he said, will pick and choose what they want to make use of, and this often depends on the interest at stake. And I think this really says a lot. And our experience in slum upgrading, this is very true. Large-scale interests will ultimately be protected and not challenged. And this is not, there is maybe not the critical mass of people thinking differently to dramatically impact in a very short-term sense on these sorts of entrenched legacies of post-colonial systems and land speculation and inappropriate or absent urban policy, national urban policies that might not be there. At the same time, however, I think it's fair to say, and my colleague acknowledged, that many countries look at these sorts of frameworks and take them very seriously and try to act on the intentions of the framework and use them as a guide for development without perhaps being guided on how to do it. And for, in the case of the MDGs, for example, if we look at the goal of 7C and 7D, which spoke to the challenges of people living in slums, he said while they provided a framework but not necessarily a process guide on how to address slums. And in fact, as we saw with the MDGs, the massive housing projects in both India and China really contributed a lot to delivering the 7D MDG, which was halving the number of slum dwellers, the 1 million at that point. But it didn't really enable an analysis of what other regions were or weren't doing. So there are obviously some flaws in these sorts of global frameworks that need to be considered. But if we look at the current Sustainable Development Goals, we feel from a programmatic point of view that they really provide some very important pointers and narratives speaking to the sorts of work that we're trying to achieve in the slum upgrading unit. First of all, the frameworks, if you read the SDG document, is very much clearly centred on people. It's not just about the physical development of urban development, but has people and partnerships front and centre. And with that, it has a very strong human rights mandate and a strong poverty focus. If you look at SDG 1, which is about the poverty reduction. I guess one of the most important ones is the first time ever urban goal, number 11, make cities and human settlements inclusive, safe, resilient and sustainable. For us, we consider this a gift in terms of our agency, that there is such a strong focus on urbanisation, and reflective of, in fact, that most people are now living in urban contexts. The use of the sustainability language in the SDGs is very powerful and very strong, with cross-referencing to questions around social inclusion, economic development, cultural expression and environmental sustainability. And again, these provide important messages to governments trying to grapple with how to perhaps address slums in their urban context. There's also now a clear statement around the role of addressing poverty through Target 1.1, which is the upgrading of slums. The target says upgrade slums by 2030, ensure access for all to adequate, safe and affordable housing and basic services, and upgrade slums. And again, this, from a programmatic point of view, this is a very important tool which gives a higher referencing point to our program, and a little bit of both a carrot and a stick for us to say things like, well, the SDGs are promoting this in a particular way, and this is how our program can help you deliver on those SDGs. I think there are other important outcomes. The SDGs focus on the elements of the 5 deprivations, which underpin the definition of a slum household, and in fact form part of the indicators of the measurement around the number of slum dwellers in the world. So there's targets around improved water and sanitation. There are targets around security of tenure. There are targets around durable housing and overcrowding. And again, we see these as very fundamental to the sort of work that we do. There's also a focus on livelihood generation, which again is something that we're very pleased about, because often the recognition of the activities and the positive ways that people in slums are engaging in livelihoods is not a focus, and we think that's very good that that's now more of a focus, and how to strengthen that and integrate that into the rest of the urban environment. And finally, there's a focus on participation and inclusionary processes. And in fact, I think the process elements of the SDGs for us are also very good, which were not so strong in the MDG framework, but there's a real sense of, yes, we have these urbanisation challenges, and these are the sorts of ways that we suggest you go about tackling them, are very useful for a program such as ours. And the whole emphasis on partnerships, as I said at the beginning, and the recognition of local and community participation, we consider also very, very important. Now, just moving on to the opportunities of the new urban agenda, and as part of the Habitat 3 process. The agency is in the process of reorientating and rethinking of what it considers to be the most important components of the urban agenda that need to form and underpin its new urban agenda. And just let me go through now quickly some of the points that I've raised in the slide there. And as I said before, there's the Habitat 3 Secretariat, who have released what they're calling a zero draft with inputs for member states and other stakeholders to review, and that will be discussed in Quito in October. What I've put up on on the slides there is that the zero draft is based on this idea that there are some key principles that the Habitat 3 Secretariat think that would be best to underpin a new urban agenda. And we've gone through those, for example, and say, okay, well, how do these match with the sort of programmatic values and principles that we have in the PSUP? And we find that there are, what is being presented and proposed has very strong synergies with the sorts of work that we're undertaking in the program. So I'll just quickly run through a few, and I'll go on to the next slide, which talks about the sorts of particular approaches that the New Urban Agenda thinks should be promoted as part of addressing the challenges of urbanisation. And a couple of the things that I just want to highlight, the current zero draft, which is available online, I should say, if you go to the Habitat 3 Secretariat. If you go to the UN Habitat website, you'll see there's clearly a Habitat 3 link, and you can go through there and get onto and review the latest version of the zero draft of the New Urban Agenda. But it really, the New Urban Agenda is very big on underscoring the transformative potential of urbanisation if managed in a sustainable fashion. And this is, I guess, an important counter-message to the challenge that somehow questions whether urbanisation is a good thing. The proposed draft very much promotes the idea that if it's done in the right way, urbanisation can be very important for, in fact, addressing some of the challenges around poverty. The zero draft makes clear that inequality, segregation, poverty and slums are some of the main challenges that sustainable urbanisation must recognise and address. And from a slum upgrading perspective, this is critical that this discussion and that slums are really at the fore of that challenge in terms of that global challenge. There's a paragraph that states that the implementation of the New Urban Agenda will contribute to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda or the SDGs. And again, that link with that broader framework provides a nice alignment for a program like ours to be able to draw the connections between how our work relates to these bigger frameworks. The proposed draft underscores the value of human rights. It recognises adequate housing in the spirit of the right to adequate housing. It calls for the recognition of the informal economy and support it as part of the sustainable transition to a better urban context and really integrate it into the formal economy. There is a section in the zero draft which talks about the call for action and highlights that a particular attention should be given when implementing the New Urban Agenda to addressing the specific challenges that urbanisation poses to countries and the multiple forms of discrimination that vulnerable urban residents experience. So there's a very strong sense of there are particular groups and nuances within those groups of people that are at the moment really suffering in certain conditions, and these need to be paid particular attention. And I think that's where some of the urban equity processes are coming out and should be acknowledged. There's a specific paragraph, in fact, in the zero draft which talks about the upgrading of slums and improving that slum upgrading is the approach to addressing the slum challenge and that right to stay put. And for us that's very important because that has a knock-on effect to addressing the very complex questions around security of tenure. So we're very happy that there's a strong emphasis on the questions around security of tenure and that particular paragraph on slum upgrading. It talks about the importance of climate change and resilience and again in the urban sustainability agenda, and given our work in the Pacific region and some of the African urban contexts where we work, the questions of climate change and resilience are very important, and again it gives us a framework to link our work on, particularly on those approaches back back to the new urban agenda, and the role of partnerships at every scale and institutional levels, both in terms of global partnerships, but then within country levels, and that including government and non-government actors, is again given prominence in the new urban agenda, which we think is very important. So there are many positive, at the moment, given it's a work in progress, there are many positive elements to the proposed new urban agenda in this zero draft that we're seeing. At the same time that we as a technical unit, we're very much hoping that there is specific reference made to the estimated 1 million slum dwellers in the world. We think that at the same, just as much as there are figures around the fact that the world is urbanised, that there should be a caveat to that statement that many of those people living in urban settings are in fact living in very impoverished conditions, and that in some cities this is really the major experience of urban life for the majority of urban dwellers. So we would like that very much to come out. We would also hope for a reference to the complexity around informality, both in terms of its dangers, but also at the same time the importance of flexibility and the multidimensional urbanisation that comes from informality, and that we can harness this in a positive way. When you think of many slums have very mixed use space, they have incredible livelihood generation activities going on, and the multiple roles of groups like women are somehow supported within that understanding of what informality is. Somehow informality is often seen as a negative thing, and there are many negative aspects to it, but we would hope that the nuances of informality are also captured in the new urban agenda. Now, just some concluding remarks. I just return again to this conversation I had with my colleague, where we were talking about the role of global frameworks, and he said yes, they're very important. He said governments work with international frameworks and the definition contained within them, and many of these documents, and they use them to know how to respond to the challenges they face, and they are reflected, he said, in national and city level urban plans. So I think they do play a particular role, and the PSUP, the program that I'm involved with, considers frameworks like the SDGs will play a significant role in promoting the work of inclusive slum upgrading to achieve better urban equity. And we are hoping for a similarly supportive and what appears to be pro-poor framework to be delivered by the new urban agenda in Quito in the coming months. And we also hope that Australia will play an active role in the final new urban agenda and make links with programmatic responses like the PSUP to deliver the SDGs. And UN Habitat and our program in particular are keen for partnerships on research, on the development of and management of knowledge platforms for transforming the lives of slum dwellers. We are currently working on the development of regional platforms, for example, and the engagement of PSUP in the East Asia and the Pacific region could be of mutual interest for some of you sitting in the room today. And finally, we would also use such global frameworks to support and promote the financing of slums, and that little icon or that little picture at the bottom represents a campaign that we've a global campaign that we've recently launched in the unit, which is called Up for Slums, Up for Slum Dwellers, and we're seeking large-scale private investment into our program so we can roll it out at scale, because really the sort of work that we do in the countries and regions where we are, we need some fairly significant investment and partnerships for the long term. While we do have some of this sort of seed money from the European Commission, we really ultimately want to develop quite a diversified source of funding arrangements to make sure that over 20, 30, 40-year periods, which is going to take to address the slum challenge, that we can make these our program sustainable. So I'll leave it there, Carolyn, and thank you all very much and welcome some discussion.
so much, Melissa, for a thought-provoking discussion about the importance of frameworks in working towards global equity and sustainability. I want to acknowledge that there's a lot of experts in the audience, and particularly I'd like to acknowledge Melissa's partner and colleague, Remy Sichaping, who also works with UN Habitat in land and urban legislation, and so can also hopefully maybe answer some of the more gnarly questions. She can handball it to you. So we have about 10 minutes for questions, and we have our first customer. Yes.
Hi, thank you, Melissa. I admire the work that UN Habitat is doing, so don't take these questions as too critical.
No, that's
the first question, and I have two questions. One is, you said that the Millennium Goals led to millions of people leaving the slums, and I wonder how you know that. Why weren't they leaving anyway? And given so many people left, why are there more people there than originally were there? So that's the first question. And the second question, so it's a question about how do you know?
yeah.
And the second question is, it's my bias, so take this. I think of the New Urban Agenda as a beautiful, glorious, inspiring mess. And how was it that something got developed by UN Habitat, which has only a sensibility relationship to the urban development goals, rather than a structural relationship to them? So it's a question of, because you can find anything in the New Urban Agenda, it's beautiful, there's lots of things which I find incredibly inspiring, but you can find anything, it's a bit like the Bible. It tells you whatever you want to find, but it doesn't give you any systematic connection to the New Urban Agenda back to the Sustainable Development Goals. And you did a lovely thing where you took the New Urban Agenda and connected it to your work. Why didn't UN Habitat do that?
Thank you.
Big questions.
They're very big questions. I shall do my best to answer them. And I have to say, my answer to the first question about how do we know that the people, the lives of the slum dwellers were improved by the MDGs, and I think we could spend a long time and a presentation itself just debating that question, because I mean first of all, the whole indicators to develop slums have really only, I mean, they've been in place since 2003, when UN Habitat, along with the experts, developed the slum household definition and the 5 deprivations. And I think that was an attempt to at least put some structure about how do we measure and track the experience of slums. And I think there are parts of it that are inherently flawed. It doesn't talk about economic conditions necessarily. It doesn't talk about the experience of women and juggling, and evidence shows that there's an increasing number of female-headed households and experiencing and struggling with family care and all their dual roles. It doesn't capture those things. And I guess I'm not an expert on the MDGs, but as I understood it, that was the first time and a first attempt to really measure, well, who is living in slums, why and how do we know if their lives have been improved? And as I understand it, that really the whole the context of saying halve the number of a certain number of slum dwellers, and being that a global measure, it wasn't measured. So and this is what the flaw of it was, because it was deemed that the actions taken by India and China at the time to improve the housing conditions of people designated as slum dwellers was sufficient to actually achieve a global target, but it didn't really talk about what was happening in other regions. And so there are, some regions didn't really achieve certainly as much in that sense. And of course there are arguments around how successful were those programs in China and India. Were they inclusive? Were the people that were most poor actually have been able to be included in those housing developments and live there sustainably? So I think that's a challenge also that we take across to the SDGs. And how do we really know? Because it doesn't capture all the dynamics of the political economy of slums and the broader urban processes. So I think it's a flawed measure, but it's the best we've got. So how do we know we've left? We've just based it on that measure to date. And I mean, this is part of the call for action. We need people to work together to try and make this a more robust so we can more clearly say how do we know people have left and moved on and in a positive way. And I think that would be hopefully some of the, there's discussions at the moment going on how do we measure all the indicators of the SDGs, and I think we need to step up from where we did with the MDGs. I'm not sure I've taken responsibility for answering your question, but I've given it a try. Now, the glorious mess of the New Urban Agenda that you alluded to. Well, I think, I mean, again, these are complex processes that have to meet many stakeholders' needs. You have governments wanting to see particular things. You have particular civil society groups wanting to see particular things. I think they're pretty tough, actually, to do the nods to everything and everyone. And I think the New Urban Agenda, as you said, has tried to do that in many ways. I also think that there are some strong messages, though, if you read through it, about the important, so the operationalisation of that through, there's a big emphasis on the role of national urban policies, for example. I think that's really considered a very important framework to bring those the aspirations of the New Urban Agenda together. There's a big emphasis on planning, and there's a big emphasis on legislation. So I think there are some hooks there. As to how, I think it's a good question about how it's related to the Sustainable Development Goals, and I think there's an opportunity to strengthen that. I mean, the agency maybe hasn't communicated that in the way that you talked about, but I think there are, if you actually do the analysis, there are some useful synergies and strong synergies there. And it'll be very interesting to see what happens in Quito, because it'll be the member states that will define how that happens and should happen. So
we can take a couple more questions, but they'll have to be short-ish questions. Yes?
Look, thank you for a great presentation, and thank you also for mentioning security of tenure. And one of the issues, one of the targets of the SDGs. I was wondering if you're able to talk about the degree to which that's embedded formally into the program.
Listen, it's one of the. It is formally embedded in the program in various very practical ways. One of them is which, as part of the phase 1 of the program, we really encourage governments to undertake what we call participatory enumerations, where they actually understand who's living in the pilot area that we're talking about, because they don't often have the up-to-date information, and they don't recognise slums because the slum dwellers are considered illegal. So we try to at least do that. In terms of how to address it, this is one of the biggest challenges that we face. But we work closely with our friends our colleagues from the Global Land Tool Network, which where Remy, in fact, used to work. He's now in National Urban Policy. And we, for instance, promote governments adopt a continuum of land rights approach, so that people have a right to stay put. Not everyone has to own a piece of land, that there are mechanisms for long-term rental, recognition of customary rights. There are whole ranges of ways that we promote our thinking around security of tenure. But again, that takes a lot of gentle talking. It requires you to go back again and again on the issue in a subtle way, building capacity, changing very entrenched cultural norms that people have to have a piece of land. So it is there, but I think it's one of the ongoing challenges that the program faces, and how to translate that over time into security of tenure.
We can take one last question if anyone has one. Okay, you, sir.
Actually, thank you for your presentation. I have one question regarding, like, people provide, actually government provide subsidized housing to slum dwellers, but I don't think that's really working, because there are people who is taking that house and then leaving it, and again creating another slum, and the house they are keeping it into the rent, and they are earning the money out of it. But the broader aspect that we were looking at, slum will be clear, which is not working in this case. And also there are some cases which I have seen, there are people who is not in the slum, but they see that the people living in slum is getting subsidized house, so they also try to come and live in slum to get that benefit. So is there any framework which UN Habitat have to, is there any strategy which?
Well, just on the first point about, I mean, we don't necessarily promote mass housing schemes, for example, that aren't connected with livelihood and opportunities and generation activities that are somehow divorced from service provision and basic transport connections, because that's what precisely happens. People move into these housing estates, for example, and often rent them out and move right back to where they were before, because that's where they make their money and that's where they live and can generate some sort of income to live. They can't live in a flat, in an upgraded house, which might be very much an improved living condition, but doesn't actually, it's non-sustainable. So we're trying to encourage governments not to do that and to adopt, brings in broader UN Habitat promoted principles about mixed use, about density, that then have a pro-poor component to it, so that you don't get the eradication of slum dwellers, which is ultimately just a displacement of the problem. So there are some frameworks there to manage the sort of speculation aspects of slum upgrading. That is more difficult, but we have, for instance, we were doing, it wasn't necessary, I guess it was more an informal settlement with some work in Colombia, and there are some very programmatic and practical things that you can do working with the planning frameworks to designate that area a special zone, and that anyone moving in, on the announcement of a project, you almost quarantine the area so that shift of people coming into the area can't happen, because you know then who lives there and who's new, and that somehow manages a bit and it's not the majority of situations where this happens, but it does manage a bit that speculative component where people move into an area because they know there's been some improvement, low-cost improvement that they could maybe benefit from. So we found that very effective as part of the broader planning code to implement a sort of a quarantine area in that project.
I'm afraid we have to end with that. We have a tradition in our program of thanking people for bringing the good oil, which is a wonderful Australian phrase, by giving them a bottle of the good Australian olive oil. Can we please put our hands together as well to thank Melissa?